welcome everyone and thank you.
Yay.
Ko Sam Trubridge toku ingoa ko Hompai te waka. I'm the artistic director of the Performance Arcade, and I'd just love to thank the City Gallery, Te Whare for hosting us tonight, Nicola Marshall and Graham, and our sponsors, Trustpower, Wellington City Council and Great New Zealand. Tonight we are recording this forum so that it can be watched again and becomes an archive of the discussions and the thematics for Performance Arcade, and it's also being streamed live. So I know from previous forums we've had, people have been sort of watching it from around the world. So hello everybody overseas as well, and around New Zealand or Wellington, and welcome. Thank you for coming tonight. With me today are two Wellington artists and two artists from Chicago. On the left we have Claire O'Loughlin, who's an artist, a writer and performer. Claire is a member of Binge Culture Collective, a live art ensemble that has made works for the last 10 years, in a variety of spaces and venues in New Zealand and around the world. I was really proud to bring a couple of works by Binge Culture to the New Zealand New Performance Festival in New York. And Claire is also a writer and has finished her master's thesis in the Institute of Modern Letters at Victoria University. Marcus McShane is also a writer, but also a lighting designer, and has produced a prolific number of works and collaborations across theatre, installation, and music, and architectural lighting over many years, at least 15, 20?
About 20, 25, I think.
25 years.
72 years.
And I've also really enjoyed working with Marcus, not just as a performance arcade artist several times, but also on a couple of productions that I have toured as well. And Marcus brought one of his own pieces to New York in the same festival. So Claire O'Loughlin and Marcus McShane, who are collaborating on two works in the Performance Arcade, which we'll introduce soon. On the right, we have Mark Jeffrey and Judd Morrissey. These two artists are from Chicago and are leaders of Atom R, Anatomical Theatre of Mixed Realities. They are, and we'll talk a bit more about what that company does and about their work. Mark and Judd are both lecturers at the School of the Arts Institute in Chicago and were performers with the famous Goat Island Performance Group. Mark is originally from Cornwall and studied at Dartington, a very recognised art school in the UK, and since then has moved to the USA. And Judd, who is a writer and a code artist, studied at Brown University and works with augmented reality and performance. We were really lucky to have Atomar as guests of the 2017 Performance Arcade, performing writing. And I think it was the last time that we were here in this room when John Hall did his talk about the comma and that symposium. And Mark and Judd brought a work called Kill Theory to Wellington for that particular arcade. And it's fantastic work, which hopefully we'll talk a little bit more about later. So yeah, welcome to Te Whare City Gallery of Wellington. This is the third and final live article event. It's titled Shorelines. At the previous forums we held one at Circuit Theatre, where we looked at dancing lines, looking at dancing between disciplines, between public and performer. And then after that at Wellington Museum, we looked at sight lines, the gaze, the body, the female body, and the politics of those gazes. And today we're looking at the concept of coastlines and the shore. Welcome. We're looking at sort of boundaries between states, between land and sea, between rural space and urban space, between the digital and the physical, and between text and action. All of this is in relationship to the core theme and the landmark feature of the Performance Arcade 2019, the pink line. Whai mai te rārangi māwhero. And so maybe we'll go to the next slide with that, which shows some images.
That's
I
you.
can do that, yeah. Oops. Okay, so in this thematic, the line is explored as a disciplinary device used to claim territories or divide people with borders. So the line brings people together using pathways, communication and trade routes, and also guides people through cities and architecture, providing sort of navigation and wayfinding. But the line is also used to discipline, choreograph and control populations through road markings, red tape, red lines, and the airport is a very interesting place in relationship to the line. Here at City Gallery we have the exhibition by Yona Lee in Transit, where the ubiquitous line of a steel rail is explored as a familiar guide in contemporary space that channels movement, corrals traffic and borders liminal spaces and buildings around the world. Yona spent a lot of time in Korea and was really influenced by the sort of common use of steel railing there, but it's familiar to everybody around the world as this kind of border that also helps kind of control people. So here's a few images from the pink line. And a particular note is this piece in the bottom right. This is a culinary performance that has been devised in collaboration with the Mexican QBT food. There's a little hole in the wall. The owner of that restaurant smuggled himself into USA, hidden inside the seat of a car in the 80s, and has crossed many borders in his life since then. And so this particular culinary performance involves him making a taco and telling you his story. On this wall, on this solid wall, the pink line transgresses. And at the end he puts the taco on it and he cuts it in half. So all the works in the arcade explore the line in this kind of way, sometimes in a sort of a more subtle or covert way, but there's this sort of this trace all the way through. In the next slide here we have images of a few works from the first session of the Performance Arcade. So we have a piece by Olivia Marhood and Poppy Serrano where the apples are removed from these wire frames, leaving a kind of a trace in the sky, and this process of kind of disintegration and consumption occurs, leaving this beautiful kind of drawn sculpture in the sort of top of the space. Other artists like Lisa Munley have been working with the profile and the shadow that outlines a figure. In the middle we have an image from Thales Frey's work, Be On You, where himself and another performer are on two sides of a mirror and they're kissing each other in this mirror. It's a wonderful piece that sort of plays with the border between these two bodies that sometimes reflects them, and a very simple work which became really poetic and powerful on the waterfront. And finally, a work by Ivan Lupi, who's here tonight. Hi, Ivan. A piece called X. Ivan invited the public to enter a space and tattoo an X onto his hand. A work which celebrates the suffragette movement, the vote, and the responsibility of voting, and the permanence and the impact of a mark made on a piece of paper or skin. So tonight we're looking at the concept of the shoreline, where the edge of one state gives way to another, from the fluid, volatile space of the ocean, the sea or the water, to a terrestrial space and a solid space. So I'd like to start with Claire and Marcus and ask them to introduce the two works that they're contributing to the Performance Arcade in 2019.
Thanks, Sam.
Thank you.
Oh, do you want to go?
Okay, this is our first piece. This is called The Shoreward Surge of the Sea.
The Shoreward Surge of the Sea.
Yes, a shoreward surge of the sea.
Yeah.
It's a, I think it's one of Claire's original kind of conceptions from Yeah, from a definition she discovered when it's sort of about the suffragette movement in New Zealand particularly.
Yeah, so last year was 125 years since suffrage, and there was lots of suffrage works happening, as probably everyone knows, or lots of people know. There was lots of celebration, and there was funds available to go for funding for works that celebrated suffrage. And we didn't go for any of the funding because we hadn't thought of this yet, but it was at that time when that was sort of all in the air, and I kept looking at the word suffrage and seeing it everywhere. And then I was like looking at the word, and then I saw rage in it, and I was like, well, hell yes, like that is very connected to women and suffrage. But I was like, what on earth is suff? And that was just me being sort of silly and just Googling like the etymology of the word suff, and I found a definition from the Merriam-Webster Online Dictionary, which is a now obsolete definition, but once upon a time, suff meant the shoreward surge of the sea. And so I just felt this huge, with my big ocean background and life living, as I think we're going to get onto, on the ocean growing up, and all of my sort of work always coming back to the ocean, I found that definition to be really powerful. And then I saw it sort of all in one idea. I had this idea for a work that was really inspired by the work of US projection artist Jenny Holzer. And she projects kind of amazing, sort of intense, often her own poetry and stuff onto the wall. But how I saw it was I just wanted women's names really big up on the wall, and what they do in this work is they scroll up, and I was also inspired by the actual physical suffragette petition scroll, which you can go see in the National Library here, which is a physical scroll, and they have it there. Kate Shepherd, who was kind of leading the movement and delivered the scroll to Parliament. It was about 25,000 names. She glued all these pieces of paper together, so they were one long physical scroll, and wound them all around a broom handle and delivered the broom handle to Parliament. And I was just really loved that idea of this huge physical scroll. But also in the work, there's lots of kind of other stuff sort of going on. I wanted to capture women, and I also wanted to capture the feeling of things of women, people coming in from the sea, because in this is the edge of Te Papa, and the ocean is kind of like where the audience is, where you guys are right now. So the idea is the words are coming in from the sea and showing how everyone, all women, but of course, everyone in New Zealand is an immigrant. Everyone has come here from across the sea. And then there's also sort of some other background to that, is the idea of the magical woman island, where Wonder Woman comes from. So maybe all women come from the sea more than all men come from the sea. Maybe we have a special place somewhere that we come from. But it's really great. It works so well here in this location because there's also, as you can see, there's a gradient on the floor, and there's a dip where you can see the letters are, and that kind of, because it's scrolling continuously, it makes it look like kind of waves going up the wall.
There's a real tidal sort of surge that sort of swells up and spreads out and comes into focus as it sort of moves up, which is, I don't know.
And the other real key thing about the work is that there's a website, and there's signs around it on the scaff, advertising, showing the website, where you go and you enter names of any women who have inspired you. So it's not some kind of exclusive, we're not picking those women, they're just women. And we screen the names so that people can't, and there's been on the past first, what do you call it, first week of the arcade season of that? What do you call it? First session. I think we got somewhere around 300 to 400 submissions of names, and they all went up except for a couple which were clearly
Wayne Kerr.
Yeah, one spam, and then a couple which looked like kind of technical glitches, came through blank and stuff. But yeah, so because the other thing I thought about it with the suffrage last year was there were so many great suffrage projects going on, but generally we were sort of it looked to me like we were celebrating the same 100 New Zealand women over and over again. We're sort of always celebrating Helen Clark, Kate Shepherd, Lord, and it's just and what about all of the daily heroes kind of thing, and the other massive heroes that just don't maybe have such a presence, you know.
That's also why we've stripped away all the titles. I mean, a lot of the original people are sort of like dames as well, or or doctors. So all those titles and those degrees and everything are kind of stripped away. So it's in theory quite timeless in the sense that, you know, a lot of the people who are up there who have been put on who are like 25, some of them might be dames when they're in their 60s or 70s. Or doctors or anything like that too. So it kind of just, everyone is sort of floating in a kind of like liminal title space. Yeah.
But it was, really, really great to do it in that first week, and I'd love to run into it. You can see that's me in it there, and kids are always going in and playing in it because kids like love the light. My 3 little nephews are visiting New Zealand right now, and they came and played in it, and they can't read yet, but they didn't understand that it was about women, but they still loved it because they thought it was about letters, like the alphabet, and they were like, the alphabet! And you're like so it's just also quite fun. Yeah,
it's been really joyous, actually.
Yeah. It's sort of like just all these women, hundreds of women just looming over the arcade. I'm glad I have done that to the arcade.
Yeah. It's an amazing sort of experience to see the name up so big. I had to stand at the right angle of a Samsung sign, so I just see Sam in Oxford Circus in London, and just sort of feel happy about myself.
Yeah.
And so I imagine it's the same thing here. Those names are massive. And
that's the thing. I just really felt like I just wanted a big list, like a big list where the names were huge. There are like lists of women's names, of course, but there's a big dominance of lists of men's names. You've kind of live in a world where physically you see written down the names of men more often, and often you see a list of men more often. You see them on all the war memorials all over the country. You see them on all of the rugby rooms and the bowling rooms. It's often just men's names. And I was like, where's my big list of women?
Street names.
Where the names are really huge, because that's a real acknowledgement, like a, kind of visual, just like the big list.
And the other word?
And this work is called From the Deep, and this is really particularly about like transitional and crossover spaces, because Claire and I are both quite obsessed with the sea, and have had a lot to do with the sea, probably slightly less on my part, but it's about what we things that come from the sea and then what we lose into the sea as well. It's a whole collection of pieces of writing that we found and sometimes paraphrased and cut out in some pieces we've made ourselves that relate to whale strandings. And so they're sort of in light boxes, and they're effectively sort of stranded themselves in a line along the shore is the idea. So they're sort of, representative, but also kind of a sort of formless, self-sealing narrative.
Yeah.
That has a lot of it's factual, some of it's kind of whimsical.
Yeah, it's like a textual whale stranding.
Yeah.
About whale strandings.
About whale strandings.
And it's about the sort of history of whale strandings around, mostly in New Zealand, but also in places around the world. About there's always been whale strandings there, but there seem to be a lot more happening now. And New Zealand is the
whale stranding
capital of the world. We have the most whale strandings here and always have, but whale strandings around the world seem to be increasing, and it's also, I'm really fascinated with whales and whale strandings. I love the creatures, and I've done other, one of my other big major works is about a whale stranding. And I just find it to be a theme that is both really real, like it's very factual and real, it's a thing that happens in the world, but also people feel so strongly about whale strandings and whales. It's one of those things that, it's really synonymous with like kind of climate change crisis and feelings that we're ruining the planet. And so like actually kind of delving in and looking at that a bit more and looking at the history, but yeah.
And also about the how with a lot of whale strandings they supposedly are caused by things that we do to the sea or influenced by them, and it's sort of like we're putting too much plastic into the oceans and sonar and disrupting those environments, and so we put things in there and then we actually get them sort of weirdly back on our side of that dividing line in the form of dying whales a lot of the time, full of plastic or who have been disturbed by sonar. And so there's a lot of talking and discussion about that when we're
and this is such a great location for this work. It's because it's like it looks like they're floating in the water in this photo, but they're on a little jetty that's just right by the water, and then the arcade is up there on the next kind of level up on the left. And the work's called From the Deep. I don't know if we said that before, because it was sort of, the idea was like these things come out from the deep, and they don't just come from the physical deep, but they come from somewhere. There's a deep feeling coming out, and there's deep sort of things we're pulling out of ourselves, and with these kind of big environmental and sort of, I don't know, bigger.
And while installing it, I lost 3 cable ties into the water as well.
Darling,
so
don't
there's not
say
even
that.
single-use plastic. No-use plastic, the worst kind of all. Oh.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks.
So these
Sorry, we
works-
probably talked a bit much.
These works have already been up for a week, so many of you might have seen them already, and they'll be up for the next week as well.
Oh, good.
From nightfall until about 11 o'clock every night.
Yeah.
Nighttime works.
They're all lighting works, I mean, really, because I'm a lighting designer as well by trade, so we tend to, I think our sort of crossover obsessions tend to be around the ocean, words, and light, and so they all sort of have everything kind of pushes together into those things.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And now, Mark and Judd, can you tell us a little bit about first Atomar, Anatomical Theatre of Mixed Reality?
Sure.
I think it's a very interesting performance group that you have formed together with a very clear kind of identity and sort of interest focus.
Yeah, so Anatomical Theatres of Mixed Reality is a collective. We have 2 other members in the audience, Colin Roberson and Justin Deschamps, who are also here. We sort of characterize ourselves as working with performance, language, and emerging technologies. And the kind of technology we've been developing since the group formed in 2012, it's diverse. We use diverse uses of technology, but we've been focusing a lot on augmented reality, and that's something that's been developing within the work. The name of the group, Anatomical Theatres of Mixed Reality, has these multiple references, but the anatomical theater was one of the starting points for the group. So when we encountered these early anatomical theaters, it's an architectural structure that really probably emerged in like the 15th century. And there's sort of these amphitheaters, if you're not aware of these, where people would come and they would look down on surgical operations that were taking place. It was a way to train physicians, but it was also sort of a place for people to be fascinated by anatomy and by surgical technologies. So that's kind of sort of, started as a kind of metaphor for ways in which we're combining the body with technology to sort of penetrate things in terms of going into the depths of whether that's the layers of anatomy or layers of space or layers of poetry or whatever. But so that's sort of how it started. So the works tend to have an anatomical theme or a reference to historical narratives that involve the body in some way, or people's lives who had narratives that were influenced by bodily trauma or bodily pleasure or different relationships to their own anatomy.
Yeah. I guess there's also these images that you're seeing right here as well. This was the work, I think, is never a fixed pathway. The work is never a fixed line. The work will always be interrupted. And I always think about always craving stability, and yet the ground is always moving, or the ground is always shaking, and that instability keeps the work going. So, for example, the work that we brought here in 2017 had to be adapted. Sorry, what I'm trying to say here is that we work within a sort of durational frame, whether that be something that's 30 minutes, 40 minutes longer in terms of installation time, but that it's more work. But I think it's always great to sort of have this. This was a piece of work by Sarah Fitzsimmons called House, which was part of the Chicago Architecture Biennial in 2015, and we were invited to respond to this, almost like a pencil drawing house, which we knew was going to be located on the shore of Lake Michigan there in Chicago. And so we sort of designed that, created the pathway within the rehearsal space, but only had that, I think, the morning to basically map it out specifically into this space. And then, of course, it was a beautiful, gorgeous, cold, sunny day in Chicago, and I'm just realizing Justin and Judd and our other performer was having to, it was kind of quite a struggle to perform that day. But it was just interesting to have this, again, the sense of marking through the material that we're working through. We generally take 2 to 3 years to make a piece of work. So the work that we're bringing here is a sort of year one of that making. But it's always, again, the interruption, to stop the pathway from being straight, or whatever you want to say, but just to somehow disrupt that, so that the work that we present here this weekend will somehow inform how we keep going with the work as we move on. And I think it's this important thing of, what is it to, this is always for me really important, but the work can be presented in a gallery, can be presented in a theater space, but actually is more beautiful, I think, in a shipping container, or in a, a sort of, I'm very curious about non-traditional spaces, and how, again, that stops the trainer in me of being maybe somebody coming out of dance to somehow interrupt that, right? And I think that's, again, a sort of crossing, right? So that, again, not to let things be fixed. And I think, again, the thing that's important for us as well is that, Colin is a photographer. Justin is a physical therapist and a dancer. Judd is coming out of literature and poetics and code, and I come out of installation and choreography and movement. And I think I'm always curious about things that should never be put together, because that's, I think, just a sense of fluidity, and thinking again about these ideas of these shores, or the fact that, again, I think we discover the making of work through things that where we shouldn't be, right? So this, again, is like, this was an absolute accident in terms of the invitation for us to perform in this house, which then sort of took our work into another space, which is great. So I'm not sure what else is there.
That's the last image of this work.
Okay. This is an earlier work. This was a piece called The Operature, but
This
again...
is COVID.
It was COVID?
Is it not? Oh, yeah. No. Beginning of... Sorry, no, this is an early iteration of...
This is a very early iteration.
The work that we took here 2 years ago. So the fluidity of it, where you see us holding these paddles, these are viewers where we're seeing sort of text, that's placed in space according to like geographic GPS coordinates. So there's a poem, so we're kind of looking through the rafters and seeing these texts, so you have this kind of, the thresholds that are always in our work being kind of announced in a different way, with this house that's only scaffolding, this kind of physical space with the ghosting of the virtual in the atmosphere that you can't see in the images, that's invisible. And then you have the shoreline, and you have the water coming through and saturating the performance space and the bodies in the space, and the wind and the cold. That was so intense, especially for Justin, who's wearing very little. So, but I think a lot. I think a lot about this idea of the house, and also the idea of growing up on a boat, or the house that's not fixed, the house that's portable, which is something even in the work we're showing now. There's another version of a house that moves from one place to another. So we'd always kind of conceived of the work as, in many ways, a house that kind of situates itself in different environments.
And what about the work you're bringing to the performance arcade? Rhinestone Cowboy.
So actually it's interesting just thinking about that outline of the Sarah Fitzsimmons house. This particular work began from us researching this artist called Loy Bolin, Loybowlin, who was an artist who lived in Mississippi, and a vernacular artist, a self-taught artist that we discovered a few years ago. But basically, his wife passed. He suffered from depression. He lost his job. He was a mechanic in Mississippi, and his son left the house to remarry. So he became this very lonely figure, and heard the song Glenn Campbell's "Rhinestone Cowboy" in 1975, and he believed that he was the original Rhinestone Cowboy. And so he began for the rest of his life, he bedazzled every single part of him, his teeth, his glasses, the full nudie suits. But also then it began to devour and take over his home, so that his entire home was covered in construction paper and glittered within this beautiful mosaic structures. The entire ceiling was filled with Christmas decorations. The TV set, it was completely taken over. So this sort of thinking about loneliness and thinking about the sort of sense of the wizardry of Glenn Campbell. When he passed, the curator, the house was going to be just demolished. Incredibly, a curator who was interested in looking at environments, these sort of self-taught environments, was able to then take that to this extraordinary art center, the Kohler Art Center in Wisconsin, Sheboygan, Wisconsin, where now we went to see it because it got completely restructured, and it's somehow they are able to. It's becoming more and more difficult to keep these very delicate pieces, and so Judd was able to actually do a LiDAR scan of the house. You'll be able to see this in the performance or in the installation, and so we sort of I'm giving a wider picture, but basically Rhinestone Cowboy becomes this sort of, again, using the figure of Boylan, who was this maximal person in terms of, again, somehow the border got sort of suffocated through glitter and tinsel, and just thinking about the experience of just trying to bedazzle oneself through actually the trauma is behind that border of being bedazzled, right? And then just personally, with these images you're seeing right here, so the cows are coming to Wellington, thankfully, from the wonders of Cohen. And then there's also something very personal. I think there's always personal in terms of how the artist makes the work. But my dad was a dairy farmer, and I remember vividly as a young child in 1976 singing this song in order to get attention in the working man's club in this rural village where I was raised. My dad was a farmer. And also, my dad had a very severe accident and fell from the milking parlor roof in 2002, and subsequently died in 2008. But again, so there's a homage here. There's a sort of ritual here. There is a bringing the human and the animal together, and there's also a sort of celebration. Sort of thinking about. We've been thinking today a lot about the idea of pain and beauty. So again, these sort of opposites of what border can be, and then also trying to find, I think Judd was saying this in terms of trying to find somehow within this personal, where is this other voice that can sort of help to resuscitate and sort of again disrupt the work. So this is again where Boylan is sort of important. So It's it's early stages. Again, this was the 606, the line that Sam was talking about, I think, earlier with us, and this was it was interesting that and I'll finish, but just very quickly, that we anticipated maybe 30 people coming to see this performance, and there was over 600, 700 people who came to see this work, and it was quite overwhelming because this line, literally this was a former single-track railway line that we did this performance on the solstice, and it just became this impactful thing. And again, it was like I started the performance by saying, we are all in this together. We are here to protect the animals, and nobody will touch the animals. And I'm going to repeat that on Saturday, but, because again, it was quite a very special thing to begin working between these spaces, these borders between animal and human. So, yeah. I feel like we've been saying a lot too much. Well, would you
come back to it?
I mean, is there sound? Because I don't know how long it is. You could play a little bit of it.
I think
there is some sound actually.
It would maybe then.
There's a nice connection.
May
with
follow.
the text.
Yeah.
What
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah.
That is both a hole and a star. Asterisms, fluorescing, in night, soil, lumen, foramen, lucky, star.
Use of obscure definitions and extinct languages to reference to sort of stuff and how you sort of make use of that word. So I think these two kind of projects and these, oops, if I come back to the beginning.
But now we're on me.
Yeah.
Oh no.
I'll come to this very soon.
Don't just leave it. So okay.
So these two projects have a kind of a nice intersection, because there is the sort of the rural space coming into the city, and then there is the sort of the liquid space. And the arcade is really well poised as a meeting space for these things, because we're on Wellington waterfront, and we kind of use that location as somewhere halfway between the disciplined striated spaces of the city and the farmed landscapes of New Zealand, and a liquid environment that the shipping containers pass through both. They sort of link both those environments in many different ways. And for me personally, coastlines are sort of spaces of discovery where these intersections happen. As a child growing up on a boat, I spent a lot of time exploring that line between the land and the sea, and the high tide mark, which is the best place to find things. It's where the sea reaches its furthest and leaves its best treasures. So the best shells, the best rubbish as well these days, and all sorts of kind of funny animals dried up or abandoned by the waves, and sort of things left behind from boats that are kind of cool and intriguing. So, and I think it's a really rich space with these intersections, and I think there's a nice kind of meeting point between your works in this environment. Not just with the arcade, but where you both kind of perform on the shore from these environments. So maybe I'll start, since we have the slide up here, with a question to Claire about how this space has affected her work. And I have another slide after that if you like to move on to early life.
Yeah, well, I grew up on a boat. I was born on a boat in West Haven Marina, which is the big marina in Auckland, which was our family's first boat. And I was born on it because that was our home. And so it was just like a home berth. And then we sailed on that boat, which isn't this boat. We sailed around the Pacific for 4 years and then came back to New Zealand. And my little sister was born in New Zealand, and then we bought another boat, which was this boat, called Contour of Cut Hill, and we sailed on that boat from New Zealand around the world and got back when I was 15 years old. So that was a 10-year trip around the world, and we sailed up through the Pacific and then over the Indian Ocean and then up the Red Sea and through the Mediterranean and then across the Atlantic, through the Caribbean, through the Panama Canal and back through the Pacific to New Zealand. And of course that was like over 10 years, and it doesn't take 10 years to sail around the world. It takes probably you could probably do it in like 2 years on a more reasonable, if you would, going with the winds and stuff, but we took 10 years because we were stopping in lots of places, and my dad had work in Asia, and then we sort of spent some time in lots of different places, and we lived for 2 years on a shore in France, but that was the only time we ever lived ashore. And so I don't know, how does the sea affect my work? I mean, I guess your childhood affects your work, everything that you make probably comes from, where you're from. So that's probably on a really simple level. But I guess I just spent so much time at sea as a kid, and I was quite a poetic kid. I guess lots of kids are, and lots of artists are. And so I spent a lot of time thinking about the meaning of the sea, but also being very aware of the reality of it. And that's one of my great interests now in my work is I have a sort of aversion, but I'm also interested in it, but I have a kind of aversion for works when I can tell that the artist uses the sea but doesn't really know anything about it. I'm just like, oh my God. It's kind of like when people use the mountains. If I were to use the mountains in a work, it would be only metaphorical. I don't really know what it's like to live in the mountains or understand the mountains or the desert or anything like that. So I'm really sort of, interested in the power of the sea and the myths of the sea, and there's just so much. I could just go on and on. But this thing here is just that for my master's in creative writing, I wrote a memoir of my childhood at the Institute of Modern Letters at Victoria University a couple of years ago. I titled it Up She Rises at the time, but I don't think it's actually going to be called that if I actually submit it get it published as a book. That was just what I had at the time. But yeah, that's a photo of my family and I on the boat. Yeah. And this is another big work. Should I talk about this now because it's here, Sam? Yeah. So this is with a major work that I've done with my company Binge Culture. This is called Whales. And this work was actually it's toured lots. We started it, we made it in 2013, and it's toured all over New Zealand and to the Edinburgh Festival, Edinburgh Fringe a couple of years ago. And it is a whale stranding. It is a mass whale stranding where performers swim through the street dressed as whales, deliberately dressed in wetsuits, and they were cardboard then, now they're kind of like foam fins, but they're deliberately in very sort of rough human but kind of ocean-like costumes, as opposed to silly whale suits or anything, just to kind of have that, what you were talking about, that real clear playing with that boundary between the human and the person. And they swim through the street, and then they strand, and then all the people who are watching, who just happen to be there, are asked to come and help save the whales under the guidance of a team of people who are wearing high-vis, who act as we call them response team workers, kind of like dock workers, who help them, who give them buckets and towels and teach them how to look after the whales. And then eventually the whales, it's quite a kid-friendly show, so usually almost all the whales make it into the sea, but some don't. Some don't. In real life, whales mostly don't make it back in real whale strandings, but in the show, most of the whales end up getting back in the sea because the people work together to save them. So it's a real show. It's a show about community. It's a show about, for me, it's very much about the ocean, but I made it with my company, theatre company, and me and Fiona McNamara, who's in the theatre company, we're the co-directors. Something I find interesting is that for Fee, the work is not really about the sea. It's about community and people and how they work together. Whereas for me, it's it is about that very much, but it's also more about this line between the ocean and us, and between human. I'm very interested in the animal-human thing. She's just more interested in the way people work and the way the audience come in. So I think we work really well on this work together, but it's great fun.
Having been a whale a couple of times.
Marcus has been a whale several times.
It's a very surprisingly fun work to be a part of as well, because after a little bit of, there's no other piece I've been in where you actually get to spend like an hour and a half lying on your front moaning while children sing to you.
Not an hour and a half.
Well,
you lie on there for like 20,
No,
for
at
like
least
30 to 40 minutes.
It feels like an hour and a half after a while.
Yeah, it's like an hour and a half. But yeah, it's about community. Like I said, it's about community. It's about compassion, and especially with the little kids who are like looking after the whales. We're sort of teaching them, trying to bring out this thing that you should look after them because they're whales, and we must look after whales, and we must look after the environment. But also what's happening at the same time, of course, is you have to practically look after these human people who are lying on the ground and need care, and you can't stand on them, and you can't, so it's like that, which is like why theatre and this kind of art is, I don't know, cool and fascinating, right? Because it's like the two things at once, the imaginary and the real, are playing out. And because it is actually quite a confronting situation for the performers, they're literally lying on the ground. Of course they could get up and walk away, and we're really clear to them about, when to do that and how to feel very empowered to just do that if they don't feel comfortable. We've never had a performer do that because we've never had a performer like mistreated. But it's fun.
But you are actually helpless when you're there because your hands, of course, your arms don't bend. So it's very hard.
You can get up.
It's very hard to get to roll on your side and kind of emerge from the ground.
I think it's hard because you're in character.
Yes.
Like it's the thing, yeah. When actors get really committed and they don't want to break out, and you're like, do remember that this is fake. You can stop. But yeah, that's that work. And in a lot of ways I feel, for me, a big thing that I feel in the work that I make is I sort of feel like everything I make is kind of like an extension of the previous thing, even if it's a totally different project. So I feel like the book that I wrote is a reincarnation of the show, and I feel like especially From the Deep, is the stranding of the words that we have on right now. That's a development of the show of Wales in my mind, and kind of also a bit of my book. And that's, I guess, because I think, like I said before, you have these things that you've experienced in your life or in childhood or whatever, and they just keep playing out in different ways. If you're going to keep expressing yourself, it's kind of going to be the same sort of stuff over and over again. Yeah, that's what I think. Do you reckon, Sam?
And I know also your forms of environment in Cornwall kind of is present in this work as well.
I'm going to have to correct you though. It's Derbyshire. But Cornwall was very important because of, and I know that's obviously where your mum's from as well, but the Kel theory, we took a lot of ritual dances from the Cornish, like a particular dance that happens every May 1st in Cornwall for the last piece that we presented here. But the rural, yes, that somehow it's one of those things that, again, like the ocean, right? It's something that, as again, I feel like I'm becoming more and more aware of my childhood than whatever before, and that somehow it's the imprint of my, of what I bring to the company, I think, in terms of the practice of what it means to be the worker, to be the farmer, to be the workaholic, to be the somehow that what is it to mine a space of seeing a father working 14, 15 hours a day? What is it to think about the practice of milking? And milking not only in the summer months, but milking on Christmas Day, right? Or to be milking in minus 20-degree weather with no protection around the parlor. What is it to be thinking about? I often think about this idea of, within our work, that there are, in farming practice, here we are in a performance arcade, and we're talking about farming. But in farming practice, this thing of you rotate fields, right? So you rotate a field so that maybe one field 1 year is for hay, for straw, for barley, but then the next year you might have that fallow. And so I often think about, in our work, this idea of the 2 to 3 year making process that actually lets these fields move quite fluidly, or that, you have a fallow field, or you allow for other things to actually happen. There's also, mining that very particular time in the 1970s and this very particular work. I come from a very, very, I joke a lot about Dolly Parton, but I come from a very similar, my father, the house was, it's kind of like a really fucked up dated system, but basically, in order for my father to work, the house came with the job. So it's like a very feudal, it was a tied cottage, basically, so that if my father was ever to have an accident or to die, then there would be no house, right? So there's always, again, this thing of instability. So somehow, I think you'll see that in this piece that we're taking, or we're going to be presenting this weekend, is this way in which there's a very particular, again, this Lloyd Boland. So somehow Lloyd Boland, again, this very working class figure, and him building this environment in his house. Again, I think a lot of 1970s houses were probably like this, but again, this sort of bedazzled, sort of thinking about the country and western, the sort of the narrative of this mythical, whoever this idea of the cowboy was, as somehow as a way to celebrate, distract our lives of growing up with a coal fireplace and no heating upstairs, and anyway, things like that. But yeah, so somehow those imprints, those sort of formative imprints.
You've all presented work in the Performance Arcade before. What has been the impact on your work of presenting by the sea or in that particular space?
Trying to recall. It's sort of banal, but the way that the location changes everything, So one thing I remember about performing by water, we performed, it kind of bookends, because we performed Cal Theory at the beach in Chicago on the shore, and then we performed it here on the shoreline. And I don't know, one of the things I remember about performing on the shoreline is there's one of the figures in Cal Theory that we were looking at was the computer scientist Alan Turing, and his relationships to kind of being persecuted and prosecuted for his homosexuality when it was illegal. And it was sort of around this whole thing, but he had a short story where he fictionalized himself, and he wrote about his great discovery as a buoy. And he had this fantasy, which is so interesting because it's just about language as a material, of removing the U from the word buoy and being left with boy. And this was sort of this really subversive act in a sort of sense. But I remember performing that text and like looking at a buoy or something. That's just one of those really literal moments where you're talking about a house and you're inside one. Or, but one of the nice things about this piece, which isn't so much about the sea, but there's when you saw on the shore, when I'm performing on the lake with the augmented reality text, there's a term I was working with when we started the work, which is the word foramen, which has to do with holes in the body, and especially like the holes in bones. But there's also a star by that name. And that star can only be seen in the southern hemisphere. So it's a star that, and it's a really volatile star that's on the verge of collapse, and which could be a consequential collapse for the universe. But that's not so much about the sea, but
If you didn't know, now you know.
but what I'm imagining is looking out,
Is the art center
over
aware
the
of
sea and seeing, I don't know where the Southern Cross is at night, but the stars
It's very close
just
to
below
the-
the Southern Cross. I remember seeing the Southern Cross last. So that was just one of those discoveries, or one of those sea changes or something like that, like this sort of seed planted in the work that you can get closer to by being on a different shoreline than the one where the work was enacted or conceived or something like that.
I guess when we knew we were coming back, we remembered the Southern Cross. And so we started looking at the
Yeah.
star map.
And I recalled that this star could only be seen from certain locations below a certain line of latitude.
Right. I mean, I guess those
So
accidents.
that has to do with the sea in the sense of maybe navigation, or the way in which we're guided through unknowing, right? And different places bring out these other aspects, or allow things to materialize that couldn't otherwise, that wash ashore in a sense, that bring us closer to things. They become a little bit more visible in this sense. Yeah, in this.
And in this work, I'm really also fascinated by the sort of queering of rural iconography as well, and how the cow, the farmer, how that's kind of turned around in the way that you're turning around the monument. And so, with the list of names on it, monumental. And I find that those both quite sort of powerful devices in the work.
Well, it's always, I mean, again, everything's an accident, but I think there's something about the amount of conversations that I had with my family around Brexit, which was, I mean, I think we've all had those conversations, and then, obviously we're in obviously you're in it feels like New Zealand is like where we all should be living right now. I mean, well, sorry, just in the sense of the politic of, just the sense of the politic of what came out of Brexit, what came out of the Trump election was the sort of the divide, or the sort of, the conversation around the rural versus the city, right? I mean, it was just interesting just seeing how complicated that conversation was, and actually always being able to sort of turn the conversation with every single member of my family, except actually my stepmother and my sister, who all voted to remain. But it ended up being, again, just removing people out of my life, because actually they just were not willing to actually listen to what actually was, still having this idea that we were an empire. And again, having the same conversation then, Brexit was what? 25th, whatever, sorry, it was actually the same cycle as the Trump fucking thing.
Yeah, 2016.
So it was interesting, actually, when we did the show in Chicago, that we found this incredible democratic farmer. These cows had been on TV. They were like celebrity cows. But he was adamant that he was so excited for this idea of bringing, again, opening up this conversation, so that, again, it was amazing to us that the amount of people that we spoke to had never seen a live cow, right? And just somehow to be able to sort of, again, I'm the only person, I mean, I think we all probably, in terms of my background, I'm the only person out of my family that literally has a higher education degree. Everybody else still left school at 16. And, so I feel fortunate that I'm in this place of, being able to, can make those connections between the rural and the city, whatever that means, or just to be able to talk about what it means to then also have a father that was who raised me, actually, because my real mother abandoned, left us all when I was 3 years old, that somehow he played that both father and mother, right? So there's always this thing of, I've always been so curious about what he gave me as a person growing up, and would always be dressing up like this, like what was that? What was that about? These working class guys that dressed up in this kind of very dandy sort of queering ways, in terms of the. But again, that was the 1970s, right? There was some kind of magic there. Yes, I think again, I'm always wanting to talk to, to make that gap between the rural and the city, and I think that I often have conversations in the art school where it's like people don't want to have that conversation, right? Because they're in their own other bubbles, right? Whereas I think these, I worked for the, I'll finish, but I worked for the, I did volunteering, phone banking for the Hillary campaign, because I knew that this was going to happen, having seen Brexit happen, knowing that this was going to happen, how important it was to basically get outside of your bubble, right? So it's this was a risk for us to work with the cows, right? But somehow I'm not very good in terms of in jet world, in terms of maybe talking to digital artists or computer scientists, and yet I'm comfortable to go and talk to a farmer and be as queer as camp as I am, and still somehow get around to chat. It's good just to chit chat. I'm sorry, I'm not drunk. But it's good to I think it is right. We all have different ways of communicating with people, right? And crossing over, right?
Yeah. It makes me think, just like thinking about my Wales work, one of the things behind wanting to do that work was to take the experience of whale strandings to places where they haven't been seen before, because we have this knowledge in New Zealand that they happen all the time, but actually lots of people haven't experienced them. Right. And I think it's going to be so amazing to see some cows on the waterfront, because we've got such you're in a country that the cows are everywhere, our dairy industry is massive and powerful but yet I think just the way I want to take the sea creature into places where it shouldn't be. You're going to bring some cows into where they shouldn't be on the sea. That's going to be cool and weird.
Yeah. Cow stranding.
Except sometimes you do see all the cows walking along the beaches in rural New Zealand. You're there's a bunch of cows on the beach.
I think it's the same thing with the text. It's kind of not where it should be either.
Yeah, that whole thing of not where it should be.
And these other works by Marcus, that same character where words appear underwater. Did you want to say anything about that?
Yeah, I guess so, because that was actually I did a test version of this piece, which is called "If Words Are Water," and about 2 performance arcades ago.
Same one.
Gosh. And it was which was good. I did, because it broke about 3 times. I spent most of the arcade fixing it and then breaking it again. But it's sort of a good destruction test. I do really like water and light and text and making things. So this was one that was really interesting as well, being on the coast, because of course it's actually in the water, but the audience need to be on the land somewhere to see it. Right. And it's a series of layered words that form, I think, 62 different phrases that shift and change. They'd fade down and then fade up and rise down, saying different things. And it's 2.5 meters high by 45 meters long, and it floats about 1 meter under the surface of the water at night. So it's really that came from that idea of, and all the phrases are about ownership of words, ownership of vocabulary, and by shifting 1 or 2 words, they'd also talk about ownership of water and water rights. So they'll make these bold statements about water rights and colonialism around language and around water, because both of them are such shifting mediums that are so hard to nail down. But it also really came from this idea that we see water as a surface, but it's not, it's a volume. There's so much going on in there. And I have so by having it 1 meter under the water, you can't see the water at night, of course, but it illuminates. There's so much light coming off this thing that you can see the fish around it, and you can see the water becomes a really visible volume. And because it's hanging from little black buoys, when waves come through it, you see a ripple in the words, even though you don't see the waves themselves. This is another installation of the same piece that was actually in a duck pond, though, and then all you saw was night ducks foraging for some sort of strange night slugs.
Wow.
But I think that's an installation in Lux, and it's in the Wellington Lagoon. That's actually not far. That's here. It's not far from. I think we can almost see the city
Performance Arcade
gallery.
is over.
it's right
There's
here.
Te Papa.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's in
Yeah, it's the
Wellington.
other side of Te Papa. That's actually in Wellington. That
Oh
one.
yeah, the city gallery is just over there on like the right.
Okay.
Yeah, I think a lot of that idea of a volume is that water is a huge volume and sort of contains a lot more, whereas we just see it as a two-dimensional surface, which is one of the least important parts about it as well. We only see that almost the line at the top, but not below it.
Right.
I had a strange experience when I always loved making things in water as well. And when I was 11, I made a boat out of a bathtub that I'd found that was abandoned, and sort of talked another 11-year-old boy called Brendan into trying to sail it in the Otaki River with me. And so we built like a sledge and got it down to the river, and it had fully had plans to sail out to an island and kind of, very colonialist kind of white children. And then of course my 11-year-old job of plugging the bath plug hole wasn't really as good as it could have been. So we made it to about the middle of the river, and then swam back. But every time I think of that river, I always think that somewhere underneath there, just that sense of going into it and feeling, the volume's coming up to meet me. And then being like the whole thing vanishing around you and you being left at the surface. That sense that is the bathtub still there somewhere? So I'm really quite fascinated with the fact that we perceive it as a surface, but it's not as a huge volume with, I think it's that 96% of all life on Earth is in the sea.
Right.
So by weight, they reckon. So it's just,
There's the power of the shoreline or the border or the edge is it often puts things where they shouldn't be. So, it submerges things or it washes things up. The whales or the bathtub.
Or if you put electricity into water as well, like with this one, you very rapidly find out it's not where it's meant to be too. So that's why there's a lot of breakages and fixings and changing of design.
I think that's also the delight in the sort of how you use the text in this sort of augmented reality is you're finding inside the borders of letters other words and poems, and there's that kind of the threshold's already been crossed in that space in really interesting ways. Text hidden inside objects.
Thinking a lot about formerly text was also thought of as a surface, right? But when you get into 3D space, text becomes volumetric just by default. So when I work with text, it's a geometry that has depth, and that's just what it is technically. So if I want to have text as a surface, I have to flatten it. So it's not that I'm expanding it; it's that I'm not flattening it. So the idea of probing those surfaces and populating those surfaces with other layers and excavating those texts. Something that I was thinking about when we were talking about the sea as being the surface as being volumetric. That language is also a surface that is volumetric.
Yeah.
Water. And this has suddenly had a question pop into their head after a moment of blankness.
No, I was thinking about this is when we taught a workshop, we had a student, I think she was Latvian, right, who told us that
yes.
that in Latvia they name all of their cows for rivers so that the milk will flow. So I was thinking when you were talking about the bathtub and the river of how to connect the cows to that kind of a landscape.
Cows are really connected to our rivers here.
I'll tell you more about that.
Yeah. In a bad way.
I see.
The cows ruin the rivers. Anyway, there's heaps for you.
They're
I think you guys are
polluting
doing
the
quite
river. A lot of food for
incredible
thought.
political work in this context in New Zealand, because
Yeah.
Oh, you really are.
What are they doing to
Yeah.
the rivers?
Oh, they ruin the rivers, all of the pollution, all
And
the
the-
runoff.
Just the runoff
Yeah.
from their
But it's a real,
excrement?
like it's,
Yeah.
but the rivers are really ruined in New Zealand, like
Yeah.
to a
By-
crazy degree.
Yeah.
By dairy farming.
What is
Yeah.
out the methane, right?
Just
There's
'cause
all
Yeah,
kinds of
yeah,
damage
yeah.
that the cows do to
Yeah.
the environment.
Yeah, but then they're our biggest like export and income, you know.
Right.
Yeah.
And then you're bringing them onto this water where they go off, not in a living form, but you know, over the sea.
It's also a country
Yeah.
that's had no
Just
large
preparing you for what your
land
work is gonna
mammals at
do.
all.
Right.
So
It's good to
cows
have
are
the
absolutely
romance
foreign
of
to the
the
environment
rivers
here. You know, there's no
disrupted.
prairies. They've never been a part of any New Zealand ecosystem. So
Yeah.
it's really, they really do make
Yeah,
a
they're a
huge
big
impact
meaning
on it.
here. I think that's really interesting.
Normally when you see cows on the shoreline, they've fallen from
Yeah.
cliffs
Oh,
over
Oh my gosh.
and land on the beaches.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
So it's like a fallen cow. Wow.
Mm.
Or a highland, more like a highland. So there's a person up there who's got a question or a response.
Yeah, I was going to carry on with the thing of cows.
I just want to come back to these cows, these actual cows.
But you started off with the emphasis from the Rhinestone Cowboy. So the actual, where did you make the leap from the cowboy to actually involve with real cows, rather than just the imagery of cowboy?
I think again, this is just something, I mean, it's personal. Well, it's not personal because everything's, I'm so transparent, but it was again that growing up, it's this thing of, it's the trauma. There's something, again, the bedazzlement, the trauma, but I remember very vividly singing that song as a 3-year-old on the farm, as well as singing the song in this working men's club that my dad would go to every Saturday night and get dressed up as a cowboy. You know, he would literally, you know, they would have all the Western shirts, and I mean, that was the style at the time, but there's something about, so somehow, because my dad was a dairy farm, well, he was a herdsman, he milked the cows and was like, you know, always covered in shit and stuff, but every Saturday night he got dressed up, you know, so it's like, but it was like, yeah, I mean, and then, yeah, he passed away, and fell from the milking parlor. It's interesting, this thing of he fell from the milking parlor roof and landed on like 18 feet, whatever that is in meters, but fell onto concrete floor. So there's something about thinking about Rhinestone Cowboy, trauma, bedazzle, you know, like, so, yeah, not sure if I'm answering your question, but, and you know, it's that thing of, this is me just getting older, but I'm starting to realize, fuck it, why not work with cows? Like, you know what I mean? Like because they were part of my childhood. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
It's like, you know, it's like this thing of, I feel like maybe this is about border crossings, but you're trained. It's funny that my teacher isn't here, but Sally Morgan now lives here, and there's something about being trained as a performance artist, but actually you're not. So sometimes, you know, you're not meant to do these kinds of things, right? So it's like, well, actually, why not? Why not do the things that you feel like you shouldn't do, right? So cows and somehow tinsel are now in the vocabulary, right? So yeah, sorry, I didn't mean to.
well, I think also, I mean, it's also, again, a matter of language in the way that the word suffrage produces all of this material. Just the presence of taking that word apart. And, you know, there's that the words that we're working with, or the words within the words we're working with, you know, can lead to these other linguistic connections.
Didn't we discover that Gertrude Stein used cows as a metaphor for gay sex, right? Was it?
The cow is a female orgasm.
Never heard that before.
I'm just reflecting.
I don't know if it's only
on
female.
these two different spaces. So, in the context of Aotearoa New Zealand, so we are an island nation, and our shorelines and our beaches are all kind of very much part of our culture. But beyond this thing called sea blindness. So we don't. So what you've been doing is kind of bringing the sea to us in a way. And we are a farming nation, and you know, most of us that live in now, and, you know, there are kids that are growing up who haven't seen a cow and have to go to a special farm
Yeah.
or a zoo or something to see a cow. So, you know, you talked about this bringing them where they shouldn't be, but it's also about, for us, a cultural thing where we have the language of being an island nation, a maritime nation, a farming nation, but actually most people don't live that at all.
Right. Yeah.
But it's kind of like, you're sort of also saying that we don't now, but we did. Like it's very much there, and not even, not in long ago history, like in recent history where we, you know, everyone had a kind of connection to farms or to, you know, animals and to cows and recently, and then with the sea thing, like that was the kind of thing where they were saying about Shoreward Surge, with all of the women in New Zealand and all the people in New Zealand coming originally from across the sea somewhere, is that we all, even though I've experienced it in life more often and more recently, as has Sam and lots of people, but like every one of us somewhere in our beginning of our being knows what it is to have come from a deep place in the ocean across the water, you know, to here. So it's kind of like, I think in this kind of work, you're sort of recalling, and you're asking the audience to then go to that place where they recall that as well from somewhere inside them, you know, those things that they sort of, it seems so unfamiliar when you encounter kind of work that's kind of weird and crazy, but then you're like, but I see something that I recognise in it, and it's, you know, just comes from a collection of experiences. Yeah. Yeah.
You in the arcade?
No.
Okay.
Well,
I'm interested in boys, so.
Yeah.
I'm going to close for now and thank you all, the panelists today on this conversation. I feel, it's really interesting content to discuss, and we're looking forward to you guys seeing these works in the same space on the waterfront, and to continue this dialogue through the works themselves, and with all the other works in the arcade between Thursday and Sunday this week, and to thank you all for coming along. So thank you so much. And thank you to City Art Gallery, to Nicola and Graham, Tracy and Elizabeth. Feel free to stick around and ask us some more questions. We'll probably go somewhere for a drink afterwards, and feel free to join us. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.